Hello and good morning. Welcome to Mountain Standard Time. I'm your host, Nathan Giede. Of course, today is Thursday. Every Thursday, it's the same thing we do every other Thursday. We've got Aaron Ekman on to tell us about the news roundup for the week and help give us some color commentary, both for Canada and here locally in British Columbia. And then, of course, a little bit later on, we'll have Stuart Parker to talk to us a little bit about the whole cancellation of Canada Day from his perspective and what it really means. Should sovereigntists be in favor, against it? Who knows? We're going to get there when we get there. But of course, as always, make sure that you take out a subscription online with us at the Western Standard to help support independent journalism and follow us on social media to know when we go live. We're going to get right to the news roundup. It's not going to be a big monologue today, but I do owe our sponsors their spot. And of course, I'm happy to have that on our show. We have Resistance Coffee Company. I'll put them up there right away. And of course, we start with, are you tired of corporations using your dollars for woke causes? Well, have no fear when it comes to supporting Resistance Coffee from Weyburn, Saskatchewan. You can get them online. When you order from Resistance Coffee, a portion of your purchase goes on to help fight for more freedoms for Canadians, not less. Be sure to use Western Standard's promo code to get 10% off your first order. And that, of course, is Resistance Coffee Company, the only coffee company that we support on Mountain Standard Time. We're going to get Aaron into the stream right away here and go live to the man on the heart.
Oh, sorry, I didn't notice you there. I was too busy drinking this wonderful Resistance coffee. It's
there it is.
It's all gone already. It's amazing. I didn't know they made such good coffee there in Saskatchewan. You know, there's a couple of things us British Columbians pride ourselves on. One is, like the green stuff. But we also kind of pride ourselves on coffee. But the big secret is, we don't grow the beans here. We sort of import them and then we roast them. Well, they're clearly doing the same thing in Saskatchewan. And I tell you, it's pretty good.
It's good stuff.
It's a good sponsor.
Well, let's start from the top. This week was a bit up and down in Canadian politics. There's definitely some people being woke, some people going broke. What's the news? What's the news, Aaron?
Well, it was, if you're perverse enough to watch the legislature feeds and question period, etc., the week was it was a bit low key in British Columbia. They're still talking about, the opposition's really having a tough time kind of finding anything that really sticks. They're still pounding the drum on the cruise ship industry and how, from their perspective, the Premier and the BC government has bungled this arrangement we had with the United States. We talked about that previously. And they're still hammering away at them on not providing similar subsidies to vets that they're also providing to the Legion. So, if you're a BC Liberal this week, I guess those are the two most important things in British Columbia. The reality, of course, is that there's far more important things going on. And as your viewers will probably know quite well, the price of lumber, especially if anybody's out trying to do any home renos or even just build a patio out back now that it's June, trying to build some garden beds, etc., it's going to cost you a lot of money to get the wood to do that. It's gone up about 2 or 3 times. My neighbor was just telling me they're building a shed in their backyard, and they spent $500 just on the plywood, and they only had 5 sheets. That's $100 a sheet of plywood.
That's insane.
So Well, not only is it insane, but I remember, when COVID first hit back in March 2020, I was rifling through my closet and I stumbled upon an unopened box of masks back when toilet paper and masks were the hot commodity of the day. And I thought, oh my goodness, I'm rich. Well, it's the same thing going on with the sheets of plywood sitting in my backyard. I mean, the joke is I'm going to tear down my house, sell the wood so I can buy a bigger house. It's just ridiculous. But what makes people so angry, I think, certainly makes me angry, is that it's British Columbia. So there shouldn't be the kind of fiber shortage that we're experiencing that's driving, in part, because it's also it's not just the BC product that's going up in price. It's actually American housing starts that's really driving the demand for it. But it is a fiber shortage. And for British Columbia not to be positioned so that we can really benefit from this increase in price is enraging, given that this should be the primary industry in our province and has been for so long. And we're now suffering from our own fiber shortages because we've just totally mismanaged the entire industry and our fiber supply. And I know you've had a number of guests on, in particular, James Steidel, who is very active in that Stop the Spray coalition here in the north, who have gone over this in great detail and analyzed why it is. But so it requires a bit of analysis in terms of what's happening in the market and what the provincial government is doing about it, if anything. And of course, the big headline that sort of distracts from the underlying economic influences on the price of lumber right now is what's going on in Fairy Creek. And I know you've talked about that a bit here. So there's this big, basically scrap between, you could sort of say three parties, I suppose. There's the provincial government on one hand, there's the logging company or companies, then there's the activists. I guess it's kind of four parties. There's the activists who are, some of them are First Nations, but it looks like the majority of them are, white folks that don't live in the direct area. And then there's the First Nations bands that are involved in making sure the project goes ahead. And the call from, yeah, Pat's absolutely correct. Closing mills is the problem. We'll get to that in a sec. It certainly doesn't help. But what's going on in Fairy Creek that's grabbing so many headlines, of course, is that there's old growth there. And and I'm not an expert. I'm not a forest expert by any stretch. But my understanding is that how we define old growth basically constitutes about 3% of the entire timber stock in the province. And I'm quite happy to be corrected on that. But it's not a huge amount. And so if you think about it from a pure economics perspective, here's the problem we have in British Columbia. Sure, we've been employing tree planters for decades to go out and replant the diminished stocks of wood in the province, but they've just been planting monocrops of pine. And the problem with that is that you lose all of the biodiversity in a forest with, like they wipe out all the aspen, as Steidel will tell you. They spray everything and they don't just remove it and not replant it. They literally kill it to make room for the pine monocrops, and it doesn't produce anywhere close to the same quality of wood. And so there's still, despite the fact that we've got all of this regrown stock going back decades, they're still going after the old growth stock because it's better wood, right? And of course, there's First Nations bands that are also included in this because they sign agreements with the province, et cetera. And in some respects, I mean, that's absolutely what they should be. But some critics will say, they're also getting ripped off, and they're not getting the kind of benefit for their communities. They're not getting the percentage of benefit from their community that they should be getting, considering how much value is produced there. The other problem, of course, is that going back 16, 17 years now, as Pat had referenced earlier, most of the mills have been shut down in British Columbia to the tune of 35 to 40,000 lost forestry jobs in the province over the last 15 years. And there's been a consolidation during that time into these mega mills. And the big, West Fraser, Interfor, and Canfor are the three big fish, Canfor being the biggest one. So what really tells the story of what's happening in British Columbia is watching what those three companies are doing. And that's where things get a bit nasty, because these have turned into essentially global companies. And so in particular, and I'll just pull this up here. Let me try to share this article. This drove me absolutely crazy. I was searching around, as I do, on the governor of Louisiana's website, because people may not know this, but there's this huge investment of basically BC dollars going into the mill, into the sector in the southern United States. And let me just show you this. So can you see this headline?
I can, yeah.
Yeah, so southern loggers are pushing wood production to a 13-year high. So why is the price of lumber up 288%? So that's a good question. This is on Fortune magazine. Well, here's the real story. Let me just flip through here for you. So West Fraser set to invest $150 million in 5 U.S. South lumber mills, and so they're mostly, I think, in Georgia. Interfor, $30 million on top of an existing $108 million investment already, also in southern U.S. mills. Okay. We keep moving along here. And it doesn't look like I've got the Canfor story, but Canfor is also putting in $160 million into. They're the ones investing into Louisiana. So here, let me just stop this here. So this is what's happening. So all of this BC investment money from these BC companies isn't going into building mills in British Columbia. They're putting hundreds of millions of dollars, literally. And for Canfor alone, this constitutes 175 construction jobs for the new mill alone. After the construction job is done, it's 130 new direct jobs with an average annual salary of $60,000, just under $60,000 US dollars. And then an additional 386 new indirect jobs related to the mill. So, like, the story of British Columbia is that after, basically 15 years of outsourcing our mills overseas to China and to the southern United States, not by just allowing foreign companies to do this, but British Columbian companies actually uprooting mills here and moving them outside of our border, and then pumping tons of money into those mills. Well, why are they doing it? They do it so that when the commodity prices start to shift like they do, if it becomes more profitable to start cutting the yellow pine down in Louisiana and milling it there, then that's what they're going to do. And if it's more profitable to cut it up here, then they do it up here. But the other dark side of it is it may be more profitable, and in fact it has been more profitable, to cut the fiber in British Columbia and instead of milling it here, start shipping it down the coast to those mills down in the southern U.S. and to ship them across over to China. And that's where all of the value is. That's where all of the jobs are. That's where all of the tax base comes from. And so, this this piece by the Louisiana governor, he's just over the moon happy about what's going on here. And why wouldn't he be? I'm trying to bring this thing up again, but of course it's where's that? No, I don't even have it. Anyway, these guys are over the moon because they're getting all this foreign investment, but that's all investment that's ours. And so the challenge, of course, and the other reason, of course, is that wages in the southern United States are quite a bit lower, not just in what's in British Columbia, but in the rest of the United States as well. So, Interfor, for instance, I don't know what they're paying their folks in British Columbia. It's probably, upwards of $30 an hour or more. They're hiring workers at $16 an hour. Now that's US, so that's a bit more, but it's still cheaper. Minimum wage here is $15.20, I think now, as of the other day. So you can see, economically speaking, why they're doing it. They're doing it because there's a cheaper labor force in China. There's a cheaper labor force in the southern, the lower US states. And it's cheaper because there's essentially no unions down there whatsoever. I think the private sector union base in Georgia and in South North Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, they're hovering at around 2% density, which means 2% of the private sector workforce is unionized, which basically means there's no unions whatsoever. And some people can say, well, that's great because I don't like unions and unions are terrible and whatever. But statistically speaking, again, it doesn't matter sort of what your values of it are. I look at the statistics and I look at the economics of it. Statistically speaking, wages are higher in union jurisdictions. And people will say, well, that's what chases investment away. But here's the important thing to remember when you're talking about natural resources and commodities that have to be extracted, either cut, dug, or drilled. They're not going anywhere. We got them, right? So when we talk about attracting foreign investment and making sure that the climate is good for foreign investment, I mean, that's an important thing to consider when you're talking about manufacturing. But when you're talking about extracting a natural resource, you have to remember we hold a lot of cards, because it's not like they can just pick up, some foreign company or some foreign investor can just pick up a refining facility or a mill and just go elsewhere without trying to continue to get the supply of whatever commodity they're manufacturing or milling to that mill. And our government, in BC in particular, and to a certain extent the federal government, can do a lot to ensure that we're the ones that benefit from that commodity first. But of course, the federal government is completely just out to lunch on this. So the natural resource minister, for instance, the federal natural resource minister, Seamus O'Regan, I think his name, a liberal. I mean, the only thing he's been able to report is that the U.S. is unwilling to negotiate on softwood lumber. So he's unable to even get the Americans to the table because they're in the business now of imposing massive tariffs on lumber that's coming in from British Columbia. And so they're imposing this on raw logs. They're certainly imposing it on milled lumber. And the purpose there, of course, despite free trade, whatever they tell you about free trade in reducing barriers, the Americans they have never really abided by it. So from my perspective, the whole free trade agreement, I know Trump gave it a different name, is almost useless. It's not worth the paper it's written on because the Americans don't observe it. Often we'll end up in some kind of a hearing trying to work out a dispute, but the Americans just kind of do whatever they want anyway. And you can't really blame them. You couldn't blame Trump for imposing tariffs on foreign lumber or foreign aluminum for that matter, or foreign steel to try to protect his own domestic companies and industries. That's what we should be doing. And if the bastion of free market fundamentalism, the United States, who champions free trade as much or more as we do, won't follow their own rules, why should we? Because we're the ones losing the jobs. We're the ones that we're sitting on this gold mine, literally, both in mining and in forestry. And we're why would the Americans negotiate with us? They know that we're not going to stop sending lumber, even if the tariffs go up. And so that just drives the price up more. And so it puts us in a position now where we're supposed to be the largest lumber producing entity on the planet. And we can't even build a shed in our backyard for less than $500 in the 5 sheets of plywood it takes to side the thing. It's absolutely enraging. And British Columbians people should be revolting over this.
I think that something that occurs to me with all of that is, quite frankly, are British Columbians putting their stake where it belongs when it comes to this stuff? Is this where people are finding their political meaning? Obviously, people are outraged at the price of lumber. People are very upset. Entire projects are being curtailed. People are avoiding buying anything. They're scabbing things. They're taking pallets and pulling them apart and using the pallet lumber if they don't need it for anything that's stud based. I mean, why not? You just strap it together and all of a sudden you've got your doghouse or your the decking for your deck. Things are getting egregious, and the cost of construction is going up. But are British Columbians united enough to fight that? Because with the cost of construction going up, housing prices have gone through the roof. I've never seen so many houses for sale in Prince George in my life. People are cashing in now, and they are getting out while the getting's good. When are we all going to kind of come together in solidarity and say, you know what, enough's enough? The cost of things needs to be reasonable so that people can actually afford them, or else you just have a false economy.
Well, so much of the economy is built on sort of a house of cards. And what you're seeing in Prince George in particular is playing out across the interior in British Columbia, Kamloops, Kelowna, et cetera. And it is that there's There's a record number of houses up. Like the prices of housing is going up probably for the first time significantly in Prince George since I've been here for the last 11 or 12 years. And I'm seeing a lot of, even in my own neighborhood, a lot of for sale signs up, but a lot of sold signs on them too. So who's buying all these places? Well, I've also noticed in my neighborhood, and perhaps you're noticing this in yours as well, is that more and more of the lawns aren't being mowed. So, like I hate to sound like the old grumpy guy who, tells the kids to get off his lawn and yells at his neighbor for not mowing their lawns. But that's not I'm not angry about it. It's a signifier of something. It signifies that people that are buying the houses aren't necessarily living in them, or they're buying the houses and renting them out. So what's happening in Prince George, which is happening all over the province, and frankly probably all over the country and certainly in the U.S., is again, people are using houses as commodities. And so, if you're coming from Vancouver and you already have property, you're existing in an entirely different plane of existence market-wise than in Prince George. And so you can come in and you can buy a massive house, which in Vancouver would go for $3 to $4 million, and you can get it for probably $700,000 in Prince George. And so people in Vancouver, they saw what was happening during COVID in places like San Francisco, all along the West Coast, California, etc., where people were like a lot of tech sector workers were moving out of the big, expensive, high-density urban areas, and they're going out into the sticks because they can buy a house, and there's no need for them to be in the expensive areas anymore. Well, that dynamic is playing. We sort of predicted that was going to happen. It's not happening to the same extent, but it is still happening. So you are seeing money from down south in British Columbia start to make its way up here to buy houses, and people aren't necessarily living in them. So you start to get that same acceleration of the housing market that has been plaguing Vancouver forever, and that the housing prices never really start to go down. It's just the rate of increase starts to decrease, if at all. And a lot of people like that. A lot of people base their retirement plans on that whole scheme. And it's important that we don't blame people for that, because especially for working class people, like we've said in the past, what other option do they have? If you're a working class person, real estate, it's not like the rich don't bet everything on real estate. Real estate is literally the only commodity that is a surer bet than gold. It just hasn't gone down ever. All of our pension plan, every pension plan in the country is heavily weighted in real estate. And if there is ever a real estate crash, that's when the foundations of the economy really, really start to crumble. Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's going to happen. It's going to happen in every rural area. This is going to be the story, I think, of rural areas. Interestingly, places that have struggled to sort of see any kind of a population increase, they may not necessarily see a population increase, but they're going to see housing prices increase as outside money starts to come in and buy up the commodity. And so, you can make the moralistic argument, I think, that you make quite often, which is a good one, that people should treat houses like homes and rather than commodities. But again, the market dictates in a free market society like ours. The market dictates people's activity. And so if you can make money on a house as a commodity, people are going to do it. But there's consequences to that, and we're going to live through that. The frustrating part is government can play a role. And in certain places around the world, some governments have played a role in trying to calm the real estate market. And in BC, the speculation tax was intended from the NDP to try to calm the market, mostly in Vancouver, and it had a limited effect back before COVID. It calmed prices for a few months, but it's not really sufficient, because eventually demand increases so much that even the tax isn't the new tax on the property that's being bought, especially for the real moneyed class, just isn't enough to dissuade them from continuing to buy more and more property as the value starts to increase. But back to forestry, there's things that the NDP government can and should be doing, and in fact promised to do in their election to deal with some of the problems that we have in forestry. And one of them was to re-tie the rights of timber to the communities where the timber exists, and to try to do something about these mega mills that, yeah, sure, they're centered in BC, they're BC based, but they're not operating as BC companies. And they certainly don't have the economic interests of British Columbians in mind. They have their own economic interests in mind. And so let's play this first clip from the Premier last month responding to the lumber
forestry
price.
sector. Can you talk about the pros and cons of these record high prices that we're seeing?
Well, thank you very much for the question, because I, of course, monitor commodity prices as a resource-dependent or resource economy here in British Columbia. We look at gold, copper, zinc prices, lumber prices, pulp prices, metallurgical coal to make the steel we need to build a modern economy. All of those indicators have been fairly positive throughout the pandemic, but the cost of lumber, the price for lumber is just off the charts. I looked yesterday, it was $1,200, 1,000 board feet. It was hovering around 900. I spoke to industry leaders. They're cautious, obviously, and optimistic with the prices they're seeing, but we still have trade barriers with the United States. I'm grateful that Prime Minister Trudeau raised the softwood lumber dispute in his first call with President Joe Biden. I've been in consultation with the Canadian ambassador in Washington, not just about daylight savings time, although that is a pressing issue, but also about how we can get a resolution finally to the 10-year, and every 10 years we get into a battle with a small group of lumber producers in the United States that have an undue amount of sway on the decision makers in Washington, D.C. I'm hopeful we can get back to a free and fair trading relationship so that we can truly benefit from what are astronomically high forestry prices.
All right, let's
Having
cut
said that, we still have a
Let's get rid of that. He's not saying anything. My whole point here is he's not saying anything of substance, and it's maddening.
He's basically just listing commodities. I know what commodities are. Thank you for telling me. I love this question. I'm good.
Yeah, let me explain to you how up to speed I am on the current commodity prices. I just checked my phone this morning before you asked. Actually,
do you have an opinion on human anatomy? The leg bones connected to the hip bones. The hip bones connected.
No, and look, I mean the ministry. Let me see if I can share my screen here again. They've now released a white paper, I think just in the last week or so, that's supposed to be an example of all of their solutions to this. And so here it is. So modernizing the forest policy in British Columbia. This is the white paper. It's basically just a PowerPoint. And I can't remember which item it was, but if you scroll down to, what they're going to do to try to increase the fiber supply, they say they're going to work with, here it is right here, going to work with value-added sector reps to understand how the province can support competitive value-added business. So that's a bunch of gobbledygook speak that basically means we're going to keep doing what we've been doing, which is we're going to rely on the companies to tell us what it is that we should do. Well, the companies have their own interests, and their interest right now is to spend hundreds of millions of dollars building and upgrading existing mills down in the southern United States, ship raw logs down there, cut the yellow pine in Louisiana, for instance, and just make sure that everything value-based is all produced outside of province. And the best thing that the BCNDP government can come up as in terms of a plan to try to increase our own fiber stock and start producing and manufacturing here again is to work with those companies to try to figure out, it's this same failed attempt to try to attract investment when we're holding the cards. All we got to do is play them. There are commodities. They're growing here or they're underground here. And so if the United States isn't going to play ball and abide by our own free trade agreement and continue to try to put tariffs on the lumber that we're sending down there, we could fix this problem overnight, not without some consequence to ourselves. We could stop shipments. We could do what Alberta keeps threatening to do to British Columbia, understandably, and shut the taps off. And I have some sympathy for Alberta in that. That's actually a card they should be able to threaten to play if we're not playing nice with them. And I don't begrudge them for taking that tack at all. It terrified the BC government when they threatened to do it, and it terrified and it was embarrassing for the BC Attorney General when he challenged it in the Supreme Court and got his rear handed to him. And that was a big victory from my perspective in terms of asserting the autonomy of provinces to determine what they do with their commodities and what they produce. So there's nothing stopping us from doing the same thing with the Americans. If they want to slap unreasonable tariffs on the lumber that's going down there, shut it off and drive the price up tomorrow and see what happens when their domestic voter base starts to revolt. Because never mind, $100 sheet of plywood, it'll be a $500 sheet of plywood in a hurry. Because yeah, they got timber stocks down there, but they ain't British Columbia. And people say, well, what about all the jobs we're going to lose up here in the time period? We've already lost 40,000 jobs in forestry because of what we're doing. The whole industry is in shambles. Our timber stock is in shambles because we haven't managed it. I mean, the best thing we could do right now is to stop these BC companies from being active in the forest, let them regenerate over just a couple of years. I mean, it doesn't really take long to build up some of that biodiversity again and reset our stocks. But, the BC government's not going to do anything. They have no plan whatsoever other than to just listen to what the companies tell them and march to that tune. It's called professional reliance. It was a process brought in by the BC Liberal government, which basically took all the regulators out of the industry and just said, industry is good enough to be able to regulate itself. They're the professionals. We're going to rely on them. So the whole concept is called professional reliance. And the BC NDP, to their credit, railed against this in opposition and have done nothing to reverse it since they've been in government. And we're living through the consequences of that. So sorry to be so angry, but it's British Columbians should be angry about this. It's like if there was a spike in price. It's kind of the same as if Chinese people couldn't afford to buy tea. It's like British Columbians being unable to buy lumber. There's something wrong. There's some serious mismanagement going on in our primary industry here, and British Columbians shouldn't take it. And here's the part: the BC Liberals don't have an answer to this either. In fact, we're in this situation we're in because of the policies like professional reliance that they put on. But neither of these two parties have any understanding or any willingness to get us out of this problem. And Pamela's right; agree. It's a long-standing issue.
I completely agree, but I think it also comes from a philosophical shift that's happened basically into the 90s, and certainly after the 80s. I'm sure we can get Stuart to comment on this a little bit later, but if on the left, people got into commission government, which is to say they gave everything to the civil servants. They outsourced decision-making from the legislature to civil servants or from municipal councils, from parliament. I mean, this goes all the way back to, quite frankly, even between free trade and the abortion decision in the 80s, one done by an international committee, the other one done by a bunch of unelected Supreme Court justices striking down a law but making no replacement and then leaving it to a hapless parliament to try and do so. If you look at that as kind of a philosophical shift for decision making based in a legislature, we've been in this problem, as you note, for 30 years, almost 40 years now, and the problem becomes very quickly, if you don't have leadership, then you're not going to get anywhere with it. And this is the problem. We're lacking leadership. The left gave it to civil servants who are unelected. The right gave it to, the managerial class of the professional private sphere. Where do we go from here? If all the authority's been taken out of elected government, what does the ballot box even do for you?
Well, we've solved these problems in the past in British Columbia by creating new parties, frankly. I mean, that's really was, I know I come back to this so often, but that's really what happened in both Alberta and British Columbia from the 1930s through to the 1980s, when we'd had enough of Liberals and Conservatives, didn't have any time really for the CCF or the NDP in British Columbia, at least until 1972, and created the Socred parties. And they weren't separatist parties by any stretch, but W.A.C. Bennett in British Columbia in particular knew full well that autonomy card, that independence card, was an absolutely vital card to play. And as a result of him understanding that we owned what was here, we had primary control over the resources in our own province and should benefit the most from developing them, he was able to drag the federal government kicking and screaming into a treaty with Lyndon B. Johnston over the Columbia River Power Project, which electrified, a number of rivers in the Kootenays and built a hydroelectric legacy that helps to sustain this province today. And both the BC NDP and the BC Liberals have no understanding of how important that is as one of the foundational planks of our provincial economy. And so all of the efforts of the BC Liberals to try to undermine BC Hydro, to bankrupt it so that they could completely privatize it, and they got away with most of it by privatizing the transmission and the infrastructure. The BC NDP is far too timid to do anything to try to reverse that, to put it back in the hands of British Columbians. And so we're in this weird situation where by far the most socialistic premier or government in the history of the province was W.A.C. Bennett, who's widely regarded to be this ultra right-wing conservative. But the BC NDP, when it comes to socialistic ways of arranging industry for the benefit of British Columbians first, they couldn't hold it. They couldn't pack his skates. And it's just embarrassing. And so when people like Stuart Parker, who you're going to have on in the second half, when they say things like, if you're part of the big moneyed class or you're a CEO at Canfor and you're a little frustrated by, the slow speed with which the BC Liberals help you rape the resources of the province and ship them out, bypassing all the value production, well, just wait till the BC NDP comes to power because they'll help you do it faster. He's not wrong. He's not wrong. And so this is why you see environmentalists flipping out to the degree that they do down in the South. And you see pro-development people like me, banging our heads against the wall because the BC NDP, despite the promises they make, can't figure this stuff out, and the province is no better for it, and we continue to suffer. So anyway, that's my rant.
But think of the children, Aaron. Think of the children in Kamloops. That's why we have to continue the logging practices we have, because of what we discovered in Kamloops. That's how that legacy has to be honored, I guess. I still can't believe that the premier said that. I did no one call him on this when he said this?
Well, this is the total embarrassment, I think, for the NDP, for people that are paying attention to this, is he made that statement. I think Stuart mentioned that last week, that we can't stop logging the old growth in Fairy Creek because we'll return to the period of colonialism where we impose our own white position on the First Nations bands who want to carry on with the logging. Now, people get angry because he's equated these two things. There's some logic to that statement. I mean, we have to, I rag on him a lot, but I'll give him some credit here that, look, the bands actually were involved in the logging. I mean, they're in favor of it. It was the bands that said to the protesters, we didn't invite you here. You didn't ask to come get the hell out of here. And so he basically said, we can't approve the deferral, which means, the deferral means to restrict the logging company from logging the old growth, because we'd be imposing that will on First Nations people. Well, a few days later, after he made that statement, the bands came out and said, yeah, we actually do want the deferral. And the provincial government, basically has to grant it now, because the reason they weren't going to grant it was they were relying on our desire not to see it happen. Well, now we're saying we do want a deferral. To my knowledge, they still haven't granted it. So he's in this really difficult position where last week he said, well, I can't stop the old growth logging on Fairy Creek because, that would be colonialist, because it's against the wishes of First Nations. First Nations come out and say, the same bands he's talking about say, no, at least temporarily we want the deferral. We want to stop the old growth logging here. And they haven't done it now. So I guess colonialism is just fine for the BC NDP. They don't mind running roughshod over First Nations rights, which is no surprise. We saw. I mean, they're willing to allow and even encourage snipers from the RCMP to invade Wet'suwet'en territory up here in the north. Meanwhile, they run around talking about how terrible this discovery of these children, and it is terrible in Kamloops. And they talk about reconciliation, but they don't walk that walk at all. They don't care. Right? It's all just smoke and mirrors.
I think the green version of this, at least according to Mr. Parker, is that it's talk and log is how that used to be castigated. Talking out of one side of your mouth, and of course continuing to log as you kept telling the cameras what you were doing otherwise. So.
And that's the stuff that really concerns the environmentalists. What really concerns me is that, like this white paper I showed you earlier, it's like, I don't know, 20 PowerPoint pages of this aspirational platitudinal garbage that talks about how, we have to give the value back to the people of British Columbia, but there's not a single concrete proposal on how they're going to do that. So they just yap, and it's just business as usual. And when you criticize them about it, they say, well, all these children were just discovered in Kamloops, and and by the way, you're a racist.
There you go. In other news, You had one more thing you would wanted to bring up throughout the hour. I believe there was a clip here. I don't know which one it is though. You've got a clip about.
Well, let me introduce it. Yeah, I don't normally talk about federal politics, but this was playing out. This has been playing out the last week or so, and really came to a head yesterday. And this is the saga of the federal Green Party. And I don't normally I don't pay attention to the federal Greens. I think they're pretty much irrelevant. And I don't normally pay that much attention to federal politics. But I thought viewers of the Western Standard might be comforted to know that the various conservative parties across the country, both federal and provincial, aren't the only ones in disarray. and also what's playing out in the Green Party right now is, I think, demonstrates quite well, the problems that we face when we have this political system that is totally dominated by political parties. And the one thing that I liked about the Green Party, I don't agree with their policies. I can't stand the people who have been elected to the Green Party, like in terms of, personally, I'm sure they're fine people, but they just, if you think I'm frustrated with the BCNDP for having no vision for the development of our resources in this province, the Green Party is terrible on this. But the one policy that they did have that I liked, it was a constitutional policy, was that they don't bind their MPs by this concept of caucus solidarity, which means they're basically all allowed a free vote on any issue without the threat of expulsion. Well, that's something I like. That's something I can get behind. That's pretty much how the American system works. And the reason why I like that is, and I think you've commented and I've commented before, that under the Canadian system with the total dominance that parties exert over the political structure, we never would have had somebody like a Donald Trump. Nobody like that would ever be able to sort of emerge. The closest thing we have is Maxime Bernier, who you've had on the show. But you see how marginalized. They just put him in jail the other day, for goodness sakes, right?
Yeah.
And he's quite marginalized. And at this point, we'll see what the next federal election looks like. But wasn't able to perform very well. Wasn't able to get elected. Whereas in the U.S. system, like somebody like Trump can come in and sort of, just organize around the party, despite the party. And people on the left will say, well, that's good. We don't want that system. We don't want a Donald Trump. Well, it runs both ways, because in Canada, we also, it's impossible for us to produce somebody like Bernie Sanders. Mm-hmm. Because somebody like him is just, would never make it through the NDP, certainly wouldn't make it through the Liberal Party, right? Would have to run as an independent. So the interesting part about the Green Party to me was that they didn't impose this level of caucus solidarity, so that if you disagreed with the Green Party as a member of Parliament on one issue or another, or you decided that it was more important for you to represent the interests of your constituents, God forbid, rather than the interests of your party, there was no repercussion. There was no consequence. You weren't going to get ejected from caucus. But then something interesting happened. So, as people may or may not know, Elizabeth May stepped down a little while ago. There's a new leader. Her name's Anna May Paul. And just by way of context, because it doesn't relate to anything important in terms of Canadian policy as far as I'm concerned, but it relates to the context of the story, she happens to be a black Jew. And she had a senior advisor by the name of Noah Zatzman, who, is quite openly very pro-Israel, etc. And a number of MPs, they've only got 3 MPs, all of the elected Green MPs tend to have more pro-Palestinian views. And so let me share my screen here, because I want to show you this tweet. Many of you have probably already seen this, but this guy who is a senior advisor to the leader, who doesn't have a seat in Parliament, tweeted this. Sorry, this went on Facebook. Now, it's kind of long. I'll just give you a minute to read it.
I can read it for the listeners if you don't mind.
Yeah, go ahead.
Shabbat Shalom. I have never experienced more anti-Semitism and Jew hatred from people I thought I knew well than I did this week. This includes being on campus at York and Carleton in 2002-07, not a walk in the park. The progressive and climate communities have displayed, at some points this week, overt and virulent anti-Jewish behavior. appalling anti-Semitism and discrimination from a range of political actors, beginning with Jagmeet Singh and Dimitri Lakaris, and many Liberal NDP and as well as NDP and sadly Green MPs. We will not accept an apology after you realize what you have done. We will work to defeat you and bring in progressive climate champions who are Antifa and pro-LGBT and pro-Indigenous sovereignty and Zionists. Am Israel Chai.
Yeah, so I mean, it's an interesting post for a number of reasons. It's not something that you like. This guy, he's listed, I guess, he was listed as an advisor, which in political speak generally means he's a temp, but probably somebody that eventually could be a chief of staff or something like that. Like it's high up, right? And he's widely known to be really close to Annamie Paul. But there are a couple of interesting things here. First of all, he's going after Green MPs. There's only 3 of them, and he's attacking them. So this is a senior staff person of the party attacking openly Green MPs. Well, to me, I mean, that shouldn't surprise anybody, given that the Green Party is supposed to have this sort of freedom of thought, and they eschew caucus solidarity, so people can spout their opinions without repercussion. But there was this huge backlash from supporters of the MPs who demanded that the leader of the Green Party, Annamie Paul, denounce this guy's comments and fire him and all this stuff. The entire Quebec contingent started demanding her resignation when she refused to repudiate his remarks. So, I mean, here's the interesting thing about. First of all, back to his comment, it sounds like he's like pro-Antifa, pro-LGBT, and he's listing off all these groups of progressives that he wants to unite with Zionists. So he's putting Zionists in this group that includes Antifa, right? Which is just interesting to me because, I got a lot of Jewish friends, and some of them are quite Zionists, openly describe themselves as Zionists. They are not pro-Antifa. they don't... I mean, they're okay with gay folks. Like, they don't, they're not homophobic or anything like that. But this effort to try to include them with Antifa is just bizarre. So anyway, that struck me as interesting. But I was kind of impressed, actually, that Annamie Paul wouldn't throw the guy under the bus. I mean, she finally did agree to not renew his contract, so she didn't fire him. But she was being hammered by media, like, are you gonna repudiate his comments? And she just held her ground. She's like, no. So what happened yesterday is their senior leadership council came together, and she was widely speculated to possibly be punted because there were so many calls for her resignation. And if you talk to Stewart about this in the second half, I think he's pretty firmly on the side that she needs to go, kind of thing. But a couple of other interesting things happened. First of all, those folks that are calling for her resignation, to me, that sounds like an effort by the party to impose upon her, because they're asking her to repudiate her Zionist views and all his remarks and all this kind of stuff. Well, it sounds a lot like an effort to impose caucus solidarity for a party that claims that they don't do that. So they're trying to force her to say things that she doesn't agree with, or they're gonna subject her to a leadership review. And so far, she's just said, "Well, I don't know if I'm going to do that yet. I'm still deciding." So I whether I agree with her or not, I kind of hope she sticks to her guns on it. But I think people are pissed enough about it that they're probably going to subject her to a leadership review. But then, I was watching some of the interviews that she was doing, and she's taking a terrible, terrible defense on it, and she's really starting to try to play identity cards, which is, as I think we'll see in the coming weeks, is going to just rip the Green Party apart. So let's play the second clip here. This is a clip of her
proudly claim to support this work to diversify politics, and yet their actions don't back that up. That claim that they are allies is one where they talk the talk without walking the walk. To the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, I say to you today, you are no ally and you are no feminist. Your deeds and your words over these past weeks prove that definitively. A real ally and feminist doesn't end their commitment to those principles whenever they come up against their personal ambition. To the people...
Okay, that's enough of that. So basically, she's blaming the Liberal Party here because I think, as I forgot to mention, but people probably know quite well, the sole Eastern MP, because the other two are in British Columbia, right? Like they're able to elect two in British Columbia, and they got one out east. Jenica Atwin is her name. She crossed the floor and joined the Liberals, right? Because she was attacked by this senior advisor. She felt like she wasn't being defended by the party leader. And of course, the Liberals started talking to her saying, well, we'd love to have you, right? And they told her all sorts of things, one of which was, oh, you've got very pro-Palestinian views and you think that Israel is an ethno-state? Yeah, well, we're a safe haven for those views. But if you know anything about the Liberal Party, you know that they're not. Like it's not a generally pro-Palestinian party. It's definitely not a party that thinks that Israel is an ethno-state or would admit that Israel's an ethno-state. And so this idea that like she just joined because it was more supportive to her, and now Annamie Paul is responsible for driving this woman out. I mean, if you're willing to join the BC Liberal, the federal Liberal Party for any reason, let alone because it's a safe haven for your anti-Israel views, it sounds to me like you're an opportunist looking to eject and looking for a reason to justify that ejection. So I think that was probably going to be inevitable. Very opportunist move, and I don't think Annamie Paul should have to wear that necessarily. But then again, you can see she decided she's going to blame the Liberals for stealing her member, and for some reason try to turn that into a sexist thing, saying you're limiting Atwin's ability to be a strong female MP somehow because she exercised her own agency to jump ship. Like, it's just bizarre, and it gets worse. So let's play the third clip, because I hate to admit this, that there was a good interview on Legacy Media, but every once in a while Evan Solomon does a pretty good interview. So let's play this third clip, and I'll just advance it through.
I know that she said it was a factor, and then she said it was a big factor to me. So, but let me just get at, you were asked about this in the press conference. The media has been leaked what are federal counsel allegations against you. I can read them. You have acted with an autocratic attitude of hostility, superiority, and rejection. You failed to assume your duty to be an active, contributing, respectful, attendant member of the Federal Council. You failed to develop a collaborative working relationship. You failed to engage in respectful discussions. You failed to use dialogue and compromise. You've attended few council meetings. You've displayed anger, long, repetitious, aggressive monologues. You've failed to recognize any of the ideas except your own. You've acted in a manner not in compliance with the leader's role. This is a lot here. You have I'm reading here, a personal reputation for dishonesty, which gives opposition parties the ability to compromise her election. What do you make of these allegations against you?
Well, as I said, I said today what I made out of those allegations. They're racist and sexist, and of course it's. And again, I'm not aware of this document being sent out.
Yeah, that's all we need to hear of that. So the point there is he literally reads out the litany of charges that are coming from her own party against her work style, her leadership style. And what's her response? Yeah, they're racist and sexist. There wasn't a racist or sexist charge there. It was all about her work style, her autocratic style, etc. And so, the whole point here is that this is what's happening to the so-called left parties and progressive movements.
These people are punching down, even though I'm the leader of the party.
Yes, right. Yeah, she's in the position of most influence, and I guess what her case is because I'm a black woman and they're casting me as angry, that it's playing into this trope of the angry black woman. Which, I mean, I didn't realize that was a trope. Maybe it is a trope, but to me, it's like, well, what's wrong with a black woman being angry? Like, and what does it have to do with your autocratic leadership style? Maybe black women have a good reason to be angry. Like, I don't think anybody criticizes black women for being angry, and nobody's criticizing you for being a black woman. People are criticizing you because of your leadership style, and because and I think some of the criticisms to me are not fireable offenses. Just because she didn't throw her advisor under the bus. I mean, to me, it's like you either have a party where everybody has freedom of expression or you don't, and so make that choice. But you can't force her to turf this guy and then resign because she won't repudiate her views on Israel, and at the same time say that your party extends the freedom of expression to all of its MPs. So this kind of stuff infects all parties, and it's just ripping apart left parties. And you're going to see more of this stuff. So we'll see how it develops. And to some extent, it's a bit satisfying because it confirms what many of us have been saying for years, that identitarianism is an absolute blight and an infestation on the left in particular right now. And these kind of developments is the result of it. And we're just going to see this. I mean, that's what it's designed to do, is to sow division and rip organizations like this apart. It doesn't bother me so much that it's going to rip the Green Party apart, but it is confirming to see it happen.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. No, it's all deeply confusing when it comes to these federal scenes, because everything just seems to be getting more and more and more politically correct. And to what end? I think if you have something to answer for, you need to answer for it. There's no place to be sanctimonious when somebody's punching down at you. If you are and or punching up, depending either way. If you've got your ground to stand on, then stand on it. Otherwise, you got to answer for the fact that it's like, no, we don't think you're a very good leader. Well, then maybe it's time to go.
Yeah, sorry it takes so long to respond. There's a bit of a delay, I noticed. It's just another example of people in positions of influence or power receiving valid criticisms from, their party. And instead of dealing with those criticisms head on, they resort to the racism, sexism, whatever. I'm surprised she didn't accuse them of being transphobic and all the other stuff too. And so, what does that say to everybody else in the party who has concerns about your leadership? You've just called them a racist. How are you going to pull things back together after doing that? Like, you can't call somebody a racist and then expect that they're going to support you after and work with you going forward. So it's, and I hate to pick on the Green Party because they really are kind of irrelevant. I mean, they're more relevant in BC than anywhere else. I mean, they're now 100% of BC now comprises 100% of the Green Caucus, and there's 2 MLAs provincially here as well, and there were 3, and they held the balance of power in the last Parliament in British Columbia. But this stuff is making its way through all parties, and I think the NDP should pay close attention to this because. And certainly, I mean, the Liberal Party as well. It's a slippery slope. It's an intoxicating road to go down for people in power because it's so effective in removing any criticism and distracting from any of the real issues that are being thrown at them. But it has a consequence, a long-term consequence, and we'll see it play out.
I think that's exactly what will happen at the federal level, even at the provincial level. The issue will be very quickly, if you can't keep your coalition together, you're not going to get power again, or any kind of power, even as a small starting party. It is a bit of a niche market when it comes to green politics. We'll see how it all turns out, but I am hopeful that whatever alternative parties there are out there, they gain better leadership, because you're never going to get past go and collect your 200 seats if you're stuck where you are.
Yeah, no, I think that's that's clear. So we'll see whether she survives the next few weeks, and we'll see the degree to which other parties sort of respond with their own crises. Like, I'm surprised that this hasn't been employed more by Jason Kenney. To try to distract from the Sky Palace dinner debacle. To some extent it has. I mean, instead of calling people racist, the Jason Kenney government has sort of tried to describe his detractors as kind of like loony redneck anti-vaxxer types, which really is the same as calling people racist. You're grouping everybody into like this one sort of deplorable group of people. And the first person that we really saw do this to great extent was Hillary Clinton. And we saw how that worked out for her in 2016. And so, and that's precisely what the Notley government in Alberta tried to do to win the election in when was the last one? Was it 2017 or was it 2018? It didn't work. They lost. And Jason Kenney looks like he's going to try to employ this as well. We saw his main advisor just describing these people in those terms as well. So, it does have ramifications and consequences across the board.
It absolutely does. Well, Aaron, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us today and bringing us up to speed on what's going on both in BC and in the federal realm.
Yeah, you betcha, man. I appreciate it. I'll watch the rest of the show with interest.
Absolutely. Thank you, Aaron. All righty. Well, we're going to
there I am.
Stream. We're going to bring on Stuart Parker right away. There you are. I'm sorry if there's a bit of a delay, Stuart. Just let me know if there is one. But in any case, let's jump right into it. We'll start at the federal level, and then we'll come back to BC and the problem of intersectionality when it comes to sovereignty. Should you back the guy who says get rid of Canada Day when you don't believe in everything else that guy says every other day? But we'll get back to that later. What happened? What happened with the federal Green Party and this whole mess this week?
Well, last year, or the year before last, I was interviewed for a book by James Marshall, who is a green diaper baby. It was a history of the Canadian Greens, and it was called "What Does Green Mean?" And throughout that book, James, who's a lovely man, he's a very conciliatory, congenial, bridge-building kind of man, which is not the kind of person you want to be if you're a sustained member of the Green Party. It's not the personality the party fits. But anyway, good guy, but really brought no analytical chops to his book. It's sort of a hagiographic book about the Green Party's inevitable upward ascent. And the master term he used again and again in the book that he used as synonymous with success was professionalization. Professionalization. We professionalized the party, and that's why it's succeeding. This step helped to professionalize the party. Now, this actually speaks to a weakness the Greens had even when I was leader. The culture of the party had already gelled back in '93. And the thing is that the Greens don't have a structural analysis of why they don't have power, and they don't have a structural analysis of why policies they don't like are made. So they blame all those things on people's bad character or people's lack of education. People's lack of education and people's bad character is the explanation for nearly everything with the Greens. And obviously that opens you to some problems because any venerable political party has an analysis. And there were green political thinkers. There are green philosophies out there. They just never took with the party itself. So when I was the first convention I presided at as leader of the BC Green Party, this guy who to me was obviously a white collar criminal showed up with some crazy scheme to make the party the government in 2 years. And what I found amazing was that all of these otherwise professionally accomplished or effective people were just beguiled by him because he used this language of professionalization. I'm going to make us professional and then we'll seize power because that's the only thing standing between us and power. Now, of course, the first phase of professionalization is to pay the professionalizer. And you hire him, and then he's going to generate all this money to bring in more money to make you all professionals, so you're all being paid. So to me, what the term professionalization means is looting. Green parties attract looters, especially when they have a state financing scheme and they're getting a government subsidy. In fact, any organization that gets a big chunk of money from the government with no clear parameters for how they have to spend it attracts looters. The difference is that when the Greens see a looter, they fling wide the doors. They go, this is a professional, welcome in. So, first there was Charles Charrington back in '93. There was John Richardson in '99. I mean, he was dealing cocaine out of a steel briefcase, for God's sake. But he spoke the language of professionalization and he demanded this stuff. So why did the Green Party even have this leadership race? Well, it had this leadership race because the party was turning on Elizabeth May. They were angry at her. They thought that they had finally tired of her leadership because the party had essentially got its one seat, got up to 2, and then plateaued and managed to squeak through in Fredericton with little help from the Central Party, but lots of help from people like Andy Shadrack, who flew out to New Brunswick to work on that campaign. So Elizabeth May, faced with being removed in a death of 1,000 cuts, I think got the bright idea of bringing in some kind of empty suit. Somebody with no history in the party, someone who had no support really latently within the party, had not been a member for long, so that she could control this new leader and continue to function as the effective leader of the party. The problem is that Annamie Paul is turning out a bit like Michael Ignatieff. She is an empty suit, but an empty suit filled with hot air. And the sort of hubris and hot air of Annamie Paul has made her someone Elizabeth May can't control. And so Annamie Paul has brought in a small team of looters with her to empty the party coffers. And, maybe, I don't know whether she seriously thinks she can win Toronto Centre or not. I have no access to her consciousness. But this advisor, Noah Zatman, that she brought in, the exorbitant salary demands she made of the party, to me, she is just one in a very long series of sort of mid-range white-collar criminals who show up to loot the Green Party when it's doing well, and who the members celebrate initially as, look at this outsider, look at this professional, look at all the languages they speak, look at all the degrees they have, welcome in. With no real, that's one of the problems with green culture. There isn't that mammalian sense of, it's one of the few things I really like about conservative culture. Conservative culture really values being able to read people face to face, knowing what kind of person they are, looking past their credentials or their rhetoric or their titles. And that's, that's a really, it's a significant thing about the Greens. Instead, what the Greens have, instead of that sort of, dogs sniffing each other mammalian culture I'd associate with the populist right, what the Greens have is the culture of credulity, where they feel that believing that someone is lying to them is somehow a black mark against themselves. And especially if that person presents themselves as a member of some sort of minority, as a racialized person, as a sexual minority, or of course, these days you can just state that you're non-binary and disqualify different pronouns every couple of hours if you want, which is basically what Amita Kuttner, one of the runners-up in the leadership race, states she does in her recent interview in the Tyee. So what's happened with the Greens is simply Elizabeth May has inadvertently welcomed in a looter and her team, and has realized she's made a terrible mistake, that the looters are uncontrollable. And the looters are making it really clear, right? Annamie Paul's press conference, a lot of people found it mysterious because it was all about saying this whole attack on her was a liberal conspiracy, stating that the conspirators were inside the party and that the conspirators were motivated by anti-Semitism, racism, and misogyny. A real trifecta of discrimination accusations. Now, let's be clear here. There obviously are racists in the Green Party, like there are in every party in this day and miserable age. There are both closeted racists and avowed racists in any party you'd care to join in this damn country. But racism is not the thing that has made Annamie Paul unpopular. Her enforcer announced that he was going to work his ass off to defeat 2/3 of her caucus at the polls. You can't have that, right? You can't have the leader's enforcer announcing that his first priority is to defeat 2/3 of the party's own caucus. That's insanity. And so obviously, all kinds of people are now scrambling to fire her, except that at her press conference, she made it very clear what the consequences of that will be. that she can destroy the Green Party brand in woke circles by labeling it as a white supremacist, anti-Semitic organization. This is how when I was on the board of Fair Vote Canada, we had to rebuff a takeover attempt. And key in that takeover attempt was Desmond Cole, who did that exact thing, where the threat is either you capitulate to us and give us what we want, or you will be branded a racist organization in every city in this country, and we will destroy your brand. Well, in the case of Fair Vote, we called the bluff. But you can see with the Green Party's federal council balking right now, they're afraid to call the bluff. What is going to hurt them more? A continued looting operation or a third-party campaign against them during the federal election, labeling them as white supremacists? Now, my view is you can't capitulate to blackmailers, looters, etc. You stand up to bullies. That's what you have to do. If you can't stand up to her, good luck standing up to the real bullies. You think if Enemy Paul is too scary to stand up to, try standing up to Royal Dutch Shell. Try and stand up to your actual enemies who've got real resources and not just like a small team of Toronto-based weirdos who are lining their pockets with small amounts of money.
I think the old line, Stuart, was this aggression will not stand, man, and we don't negotiate with terrorists.
Yeah. No, I think we have much to learn from George Herbert Walker Bush and from the Big Lebowski on that front. It's pretty simple, but one of the things that is really odd on the political left is its embrace of cowardice as a value. I didn't think anyone would ever decide cowardice was good. On the other hand, I didn't expect the Trump movement to embrace cruelty as a value. So, I guess it's just the 21st century and, no one speaks English and everything's broken, as the Tom Waits song would go. But I really I find the Enemy Paul situation maddening because none of her detractors anticipated her obvious move. I actually went on Twitter 2 weeks ago and said, if you guys don't get it together, Enemy Paul will re-narrate this as being about your racism. Look at your watch. There we go. Right on schedule. That's what's happening. Yeah. Am I wrong? No. So the Canadian Greens, this is actually, both the Liberals and NDP are going to benefit from this. I think however, what's most interesting to me is that in the riding of Fredericton, it will be the Tories. Because the outcome of all of this insanity in the Greens is that Jenica Antwin announced that, she felt that the Palestinians were being disproportionately harmed, which is a pretty, statistically bulletproof argument. Stuck her neck out, dealt with these threats, crossed the floor to the Liberals, and then proceeded to apologize for all of her Palestine solidarity statements and fall in line with the very position the leader had been demanding she take in the first place. Now, I think if you look at the vote in Fredericton, a bunch of her vote was a strategic vote by Tories to get the Liberals out of Fredericton. Fredericton's a green town at the provincial level in New Brunswick. And you can see from the last result in 2019 that every vote except for the Green vote went down. And that means, and I have this on good authority from Andy Shadrack, who flew out there to work on her campaign as a Green. Edwin was elected by a cross-partisan coalition that was anti-Trudeau. And to go back there as Trudeau's candidate, I would imagine that many people, even Greens and New Democrats in that riding, will cast a strategic vote for the Tories. Aaron O'Toole may have wrecked the Tories' chances at pickups in Nova Scotia and in big swaths of the Maritimes through his purge of Peter MacKay organizers. But I would say Fredericton is, I would put it near the top of the list of Tory pickups if they're smart in the next election. And I think that's something that, Greens have got to realize. And one of the things that Greens don't realize is people who vote for them are not necessarily Greens. Greens have spent so much time condemning strategic voting that they have no clue when they actually benefit from strategic voting, right? Like they did in the House sound riding in the provincial election. And so they're in all this crazy inside baseball stuff that most Canadians don't give a damn about. Now, I have opinions on the Israel-Palestine conflict. I'm sure you have opinions on the Israel-Palestine conflict. But let me tell you, outside of the ridings of Thornhill and St. Paul's, you're not going to decide. Nobody should be switching parties based on the Israel-Palestine conflict. That's not a Canadian issue fundamentally. Like, it's an important global issue, and Canada plays a small part in that important global issue. But if you're a progressive, here are the things your organization will split over. The Uyghur genocide in China, the Israel's attacks on occupation of Palestine, whether sex work is work, and whether trans women are women. Those are your 4 issues. The climate doesn't even rate. The economy doesn't rate. Guaranteed basic income doesn't rate. Progressives, hardcore progressives, change their votes based on these highly peripheral issues that divide them socially and make them yell at each other at parties. But I think the Greens have got to get it through their heads that if they, both those on Annamie Paul's side and those opposing Annamie Paul, that if they don't make this about something Canadian, people are really going to turn off.
I completely agree. I think they will turn off, and there needs to be something fundamentally different on the menu for that. The federal election appears to be forthcoming. I have some inside baseball on that because I happen to know the organization who will be hosting Elections Canada here in Prince George. They happen to be very close to me, close to my heart in a lot of different respects. And they gave them a good deal on the space, and they're making their penny off of it. Good for them. The point being that Elections Canada is coming to town in August, and now we know that there must be an election forthcoming. What are the Greens' chances if this is June and in August we could be seeing ballots being printed?
Oh, I think, well, it really depends on how the extortion attempt works during the looting. So the thing that will hurt the Greens the most is Annamie Paul refusing to sign nomination papers of candidates. What will hurt the Greens the most is them standing down in ridings. And that's the biggest danger they face. That if Paul is still the leader and she's still in a war with the party, she could eviscerate their chances by simply pulling them out of more and more ridings. Right? The Greens became irrelevant provincially here in northern BC last election because they only ran in 2 of the 8 seats. There could be big bald spots on the map of Canada. Now, the reality is that Elizabeth May has Saanich Gulf Islands until she dies. She will be the heritage MLA for Saanich Gulf Islands into her 80s, I am sure. So there's really only 1 seat left now, right? There's Nanaimo and there's Paul Manly. Now, my guess is, and Annamie Paul is refusing to comply with a direct resolution by the party's governing council to do a joint presser with Paul Manly and articulate the same position. Enemy Paul continues to support the defeat of Paul Manly. And I think the easiest way for her to do that is not signing his nomination papers and appointing instead an unpopular, strident Zionist in the Nanaimo riding. That would be that. Paul Manly would be done. It's, of course, tremendously ironic because the Israel-Palestine conflict is why Paul Manly became an MP in the first place, right? His father was an NDP MP. He went to Israel during the Intifada. He was incarcerated, and Tom Mulcair turned on him, and basically the party actively worked to keep him incarcerated in Israel. And so Paul Manly really crossed for the Greens out of a sense of family honor, because the NDP had crossed a line and sort of tried to kill his dad. It's the same reason Adam Olsen is a Green. The NDP rigged a nomination meeting against his mother, he believes, and that's why he's the MLA for Saanich North in the islands. So these stories of like deep NDP betrayals being met by these guys who would otherwise be New Democrats. So Paul Manly will have nowhere to go. Having been purged by Zionists from two parties, I think he's done. I would imagine he'd walk out of electoral politics for good. So what the most likely outcome is Elizabeth May will have a seat. Enemy Paul will lose Toronto's centre, and after the election, it will just be a bloodbath. Who knows for how long? My guess is that Enemy Paul plans to leave after the election. I think that once we get into the election and there's a set of contracts to be awarded, if she can drain the party's coffers by the end of the election, then she's gone. If for some reason there's still a sack of cash there, then I guess the fight will continue.
A dreary outlook, but I don't think an incorrect one. Again, we sometimes find bizarre inversions and conversions between people. The same thing's happening right now when it comes to Victoria City Council having tried to ban Canada Day and essentially successfully unanimously voted down celebrating Canada Day in what they say is in honor of the 215 children discovered in Kamloops. There were Western separatists and sovereigntists now fighting about this question, but now we have to wonder, again, to the same point, is who are your friends? Who are your allies? Who's trying to loot the party? Who's trying to steer the narrative? What's going to happen here?
Okay, well, first of all, I got to say a few words about how Victoria City Council is covered, because the BC Legislative Press Gallery loathes Victoria City Council. They all live in Victoria. They hate bike lanes. And the BC Legislative Press Gallery is one of the smallest, most unanimous, most vile groups of toadies I've ever seen. Right, the press gallery, they're like the press corps was in the US right after 9/11. They believe their job is to write down what the government says and endorse it. And so we see these characters like Keith Baldry, Vaughn Palmer, Mike Smith, etc. They tend to articulate a unanimous view. It's a center-right view, but it's also a pro-John Horgan view, given that John Horgan's basically a center-right politician leading a former socialist party. And John Horgan really hates Victoria City Council. He hates them so much that when they put in new bike lanes, he penalizes them by moving government offices out of the city of Victoria into the district of Langford, where he's the MLA. So we have to understand there's a very small town parochial politics being enacted here. So the Legislative Press Gallery always has a friend, and that friend is the provincial government. It's been that way since 2001. And the Legislative Press Gallery always has an enemy, and that enemy is Victoria City Council. And it has been that way since 2001. And so the Legislative Press Gallery engages in, I would say, borderline actionable misrepresentations of Victoria City Council on a regular basis. Their thing about the John A. Macdonald statue was just an orgy of hyperbole and misrepresentation. And that's what's happening with the Canada Day thing. Now, love or hate Victoria City Council. You can really hate bike lanes and hate them for that reason. But Victoria canceled the Canada Day celebration the same day everybody else canceled the Canada Day celebration, when the state of emergency went into effect a year and a half ago. No city is having a Canada Day celebration. The debate at Victoria City Council was about making a Canada Day video. A video, not a celebration. There was never a plan for any city in British Columbia to have a Canada Day celebration this year. That exists only in the minds of the Legislative Press Gallery. No one else thought that was going to happen. So the issue was Victoria ordered up a video. The video is half made. The video sounds tone deaf and insensitive in light of what happened in Kamloops. So they went, oh no, we got to commission a new video. So they went, hey, can we get a new video? And the video people said, you think we can get that done in 2 weeks? You're nuts. We'll make you a new video, but it's not getting done in 2 weeks, guys. The Victorian City Council went, oh, geez. And of course, they all knew what was going to happen. They all knew that Vaughn Palmer and Keith Baldry and all these people who don't like the bike lanes were going to do their usual thing and set their hair on fire and massively exaggerate what is essentially a screw up about a video that probably they should never have ordered in the first place. So yeah, I step back and I look at this nonsense, and and I would say that this has been the rule for everything that's happened in the city of Victoria since 2017. There has been and that's why the council was unanimous. The left lost its majority on Victoria City Council in a by-election last summer. So the center-right currently has a majority on Victoria City Council, and the council voted unanimously. That's not because center-right people in Victoria are crazy. It's because center-right people in Victoria understand the term video production deadline the same way left-wing people understand the term video production deadline. So, it's like this bloody John A. Macdonald statue. Oh, no, they're destroying our history. Oh, really? When was it? When did we put it up? 1983? Uh-huh. And what's happening to it? Oh, we're moving it into another building. Right. We've erased history and destroyed John A. Macdonald. No, I think moving statues around is a normal thing. Even taking them down is pretty normal. Protest movements have been toppling statues since the fall of the Persian Empire. That's what you do. That's what protest movements do. They knock statues over. It's, you may not like it, but the history is not the statue. The history is the moment the statue's knocked over. That's what history is. As a historian, I say, I've never used statues to do history, nor has anyone else I know. Statues are nice to look at. They're neat. I really like that statue on the Nanaimo seawall because the late mayor, Frank Ney's right hand, the inside of the hand is the shape of a Mickey of Captain Morgan, which is what, he used to wander the city wearing a pirate hat, drinking Captain Morgan out of his right hand. And so you can put your empty Captain Morgans in Frank Ney's hand. Like, that's a good statue in my view. But the Victoria Press Gallery people lead a little bit too comfortable a life. And that's always like the danger of Victoria as a whole. My friend Scotty, when he moved there, he described it as the velvet rut. And I think that's very much what we can expect out of Victoria are endless tempests in a teapot, because after all, Victoria understands itself to be the afternoon tea capital of Canada.
In a land where there is no more afternoon tea. Like it's just perfect.
Well, actually, people in Victoria, it's like they're in a separate time zone, right? Everybody gets up at 6 o'clock in the morning. They spend 3 hours having brunch. They go for a jog. They go to work. They leave work at about 4 p.m., as far as I can tell, watch television until 7 and then go to bed. It's a maddening sort of city to try and be social in. The only good thing about it is the breakfast. But I don't go there anymore. I just, it's not my scene, as Bubbles would say in Trailer Park Boys. It's just not my scene, boys. It's not my scene. So, I think this, I'm all for denouncing cancel culture, but that was not cancel culture over there in Victoria. That was an administrative screw up that, and the other thing is, like, my friend Ben Issett, he sits on Victoria City Council. He's so resigned. He's so resigned to being misrepresented in the provincial media that they don't even try anymore. They don't try to talk, and of course, with the city councillors, half of them, like people like Ben, they've been blocked by half the legislative press gallery on Twitter. It's not like the press gallery people are even going to hear their side of the story. Oh, the Norris cartoons, those are damn good. All right. Well, what's next? What else have we got to worry about this morning?
They really are. Well, I mean, in general, the question of forestry and the question of logging, Aaron was bringing that up a little bit earlier. I'd like your take on it. What does sustainable logging actually mean? And for that matter, when we're looking at what's going on in BC's forest today, or what the Fairy Creek episode, what is the proper political solution here, so that we don't just mow everything down and ship it offshore? We keep some jobs here, but we also don't lose all our resources.
All right, so first of all, let's start with some good news for once. I'm very excited about this new company in Terrace that's going to build a small sawmill for Terrace, and then is going to manufacture additional small mills for other smaller forest-dependent communities in BC. Something good happened this week, folks. That's great news. That's about processing our wood here, and the government didn't even have anything to do with it. I'm not a private sector cheerleader by any means, but without a doubt, the best logging news in British Columbia came out of a business news story. Because if we can start having small mills spread around the province again, that is our way back from the precipice we're at right now. Now, here's the basic problem with BC forests. So Indigenous people, of course, logged and burned forests here prior to our arrival. And there are two basic styles of Indigenous logging. In the wet belt forests, the way Indigenous people worked was they would either remove wood from existing very large trees in planks and allow the tree to seal over. That's how they handled old growth wood. However, younger trees were felled in those forests, younger coniferous trees, and taken out. But what the Indigenous people worked to do was maintain the forest canopy in a wet belt forest. So you had to have enough old growth trees that direct sunlight was not hitting the forest floor, so that the forest floor remained wet, so the forest floor remained rich, and so the forest floor got minimal direct sunlight. Those were the logging practices. Now, in many parts of BC, settlers adopted those practices first. And it was only with the arrival of industrial forestry in their community that they began clear cutting. Now, clear cutting is a decent model of logging in a dry belt forest. Dry belt forests do not have a canopy that screens light. So you go to a ponderosa pine forest or something in the Okanagan, you have a hot forest floor and you have a dry forest floor. And so when you clear cut there, it simulates a fire. And in fact, that's why you slash burn, which is not always a bad thing to do. You slash burn after a clear cut, because in order for a dry belt forest to regenerate, you need charcoal and you need light, because a young ponderosa pine needs heat and light. But in a wet belt forest, whether you're dealing with another pine variety, whether you're dealing with cedar, whether you're dealing with a mixed forest, whatever it is, coniferous trees do not survive their first year if there's no canopy, because it's too hot, it's too dry, and they are strangled by undergrowth and vegetation. Now, if you let that happen, the problem will fix itself. Because what happens if there's like a blowdown or a clear cut in an old growth wet belt forest, alder and aspen trees grow up within 20 years. The alder and the aspen create a seasonal canopy that produces darkness and cool on the forest floor. And then the coniferous seedlings can grow up and grow past the succession trees, shade out the aspen and alder over time, and create a coniferous forest. Well, we did not have the patience for that, and we had a lot of hubris. So what we decided to do was to clear cut wet belt forests and eliminate succession trees. And so what that meant was the only way conifers could survive is, first of all, they would have to be grown in a greenhouse or some other human environment until they reached about this size, and then they could be planted. They wouldn't be able to grow up from seeds. And then, to prevent them being strangled by salal and succession trees like alder, there's massive glyphosate spraying that we did. And the idea was, we're going to skip 20 years in the succession process, and we're going to get these trees to market faster. So we planted a bunch of monocrop pine forests, and then the climate changed and the beetle took them out. So now we have some surviving monocrop pine forests. They're tiny, they're stunted. They have few animals in them because berries can't grow there because they've been sprayed to death with glyphosate. So the hunting jobs disappear, the trapping jobs disappear, the trees are spaced too close together so you can't hike there. So the only economic activity that can come from those forests is logging, except up north, the trees don't grow that fast. Knocking 20 years off 120 years, you've still got 100 years to wait until you have something comparable to what you cut. So we have screwed up our inventory. There are huge swaths where we had monocrop pine, the beetle took it out, and now there's just undergrowth, there's just like sparse undergrowth suppressed by glyphosate, outgassing carbon into the atmosphere, not helping foresters, not helping trappers, not helping the environment. So we got a choice, basically, and this is the consensus in the UBC Forestry Department, the UNBC Forestry Department. If we want the forest to function again, we have to stop the glyphosate spraying, allow the alder and aspen to grow up, and allow the forest to regenerate naturally. And the good news in all this is that we are a lot better at using cottonwood, alder, aspen, these other deciduous trees in construction. So the good thing is, if we let that happen, we can actually be cutting deciduous softwood and getting that to market. Stop the Spray BC. James Stettle's organization is great on this stuff. And James has his own woodlot, and he demonstrates what you can do with a fairly young aspen as a replacement for these conifers that just aren't going to come, because you know what? They're being grown. The spruce and the pine are being grown in Mississippi next to the mills where they're being milled in a much wetter, much warmer, much more abundant climate. And they'll have two generations. The system could work there, but it doesn't work here. So there are two ways in which you can do long-term forestry in BC. Maintain the canopy and do selective logging under it, which is what they should be doing on Vancouver Island and what they and the Central Coast, or you let the succession trees grow and you harvest primarily succession trees until your forest is naturally regenerated. Now, neither of those things says stop logging, right? But the fact is, those very large old growth trees, we need to keep them, because if we take them out, it is going to take us 20 years to start regrowing the canopy. And that's 20 lost years in the planting of new trees. So you can log in old growth forests without taking out the largest trees. That's how Indigenous people did it, and that's how many settlers did it for a long time, and that's how it's done in American national forests in Washington and Oregon, where they have the same climate we do. So this is not an untested way of logging. This is well tested, and national forests make money, and companies bid to log those forests. This is an economically competitive thing to do. Don't destroy the canopy. The canopy maintains too many values, including tourism values. I'm not thrilled with inviting the world here, because I don't want to see too many of my British Columbians in crappy service industry jobs begging for money from tourists. But I'm certainly not going to turn tourists away who want to see pretty unique ecosystems that have vanished in most of the world. So, I think the thing we got to do is, when I was in an argument with Greens yesterday about this, they're saying, like, how could you be advocating cutting trees? I'm going, do you know what the carbon footprint of concrete and cement is? It's 8% of climate change. You're telling me you want to replace wood with concrete? You're insane. That's not responsible. But the problem is, the people who are having these conversations are generally not people who have a lot of information about the specifics of our ecosystems, because it's insane to design a forestry policy without knowing the nature of the ecosystem you've designed the policy for. We should never have had the same policies for wet belt and dry belt trees in BC, and yet we have had the same policies for wet and dry belt trees since 1843. This sort of ridiculous cookie cutter theory of industrial forestry that is copied from Sweden. Anybody else accidentally spray their IKEA bookcase with a hose only to discover it has turned into a pile of sawdust by the next day? I mean, who the heck wants to run their forest like the Swedes, with all the trees in lines and you having to make everything out of crappy particle board and meat glue? Like, that's just, it's just nonsense. Now, when it comes to Fairy Creek, then you get into some other political questions that I think are very important to address. What we saw with Fairy Creek was the government claimed to have the support of the First Nations there. Why did the government claim that? Well, because they'd signed benefit agreements with band councils. And this is really problematic. Like, it's one thing for a corporation to sign a benefit agreement with a band council, where a private company says, hey, if you go along with this thing, we'll cut you in at 1 cent on the dollar. But I think it's really irresponsible for a provincial government to say, and if you look at the benefit agreement they made with the bands on Vancouver Island, it's revolting. It basically says, you will lose your cut of these timber sales if you don't control your people and prevent any of them from speaking out against this logging. So it demands very upsetting levels of bullying and social control from band councils in exchange for what? 1/10 of 1 cent on the dollar from the timber sales, 1,000th of the money. And so eventually, when the band councils realized they couldn't control their people anymore, it's not like they're the people who run the traditional territory. They're just running a little municipality in the middle of that traditional territory. Their response was, oh, to hell with it. We're going to lose our benefit agreements anyway. We might as well come out against this thing. And I think, and then, of course, the provincial government finds itself between a rock and a hard place, because they've been claiming a level of support that only existed because they sign contracts to make band councils bully their members for fear of losing services, which those members will now lose. Fairy Creek is an example of why I keep beating the drum for land reform. The real problem is the poverty of the people on those reserves. That's why they signed the benefit agreements. And what they shouldn't be getting benefit agreements, they should be getting the land. It's their land. They live on it. They're the neighbors. They're the people who live next to the land. And as you know, I would say that about a settler community too. I think there are some special responsibilities to Indigenous people. But in my opinion, if you've got a bunch of dirt poor white people in the middle of a forest and somebody else is making all the money from it, that is an equally offensive thing. And that community deserves to control the land around it and make money from the land around it. And so, Fairy Creek is, it has become a lightning rod, and I'm happy it has. I'm very proud of especially older folks who were in the Clayoquot blockades with me, and they were middle-aged then. So, one of the really, we often hear about the role of Indigenous elders. We often don't hear about the role of elders in different kinds of settler communities. But just when it looked like the Fairy Creek blockades were going to go badly, a bunch of seniors came forward, got back into activism, and led the charge out to Fairy Creek and overwhelmed the police roadblocks and really showed the younger people how it was done, how you build a big common front, how you behave with honor. And of course, the older people are better trained in civil disobedience. And so people like my friend Donna Clark went out there, and I can't thank them enough. I think they elevated the debate, they elevated the practice, and they stopped some of the logging, and they changed the conversation. I think what we need to do to honor those people is have a conversation that is rooted in specific knowledge of ecosystems about where to go from here. Because, and that's fundamentally the problem sovereigntist folks are dealing with, right? That people are making policy from far away without specific knowledge. And the solution to Fairy Creek is to just bring everything closer to home.
Yeah, to finally have some kind of some semblance of giving away power back to the local level, and to ensure that people can actually make their will be done in their neighborhood. As we kind of round out the hour here, Stuart, what are you looking forward to as the summer progresses? I know that reopening plan of BC probably isn't perfect in your mind, but as we do come out of the COVID lockdown and head back to some other political questions, did we learn anything? Have we taken the right notes along the way?
Absolutely not. I don't think we learned anything from COVID. And I think what we've seen during COVID is everybody is eager to get back to the tailspin we were in before. I think that in terms of who made money during COVID, that tells the story of COVID, right? COVID is a period of another giant upward wealth transfer. And that means that we're coming back to the same problems we had before COVID, but following an increase in the power imbalance that is generating a bunch of those problems. Now, I also want to so the thing is, I'm going to say something about the reopening plan. Like, as a politically informed and responsible person, I oppose the reopening plan. As an individual who has friends, I welcome the reopening plan. My reaction to the reopening plan is really, when people talk about voters voting against their interests, so they talk about voters as individual choice makers, I think what they miss is that both of those impulses exist in each of our souls, right? The desire to do what is good for us and the desire to collectively rise to the occasion as a people. And you can't collapse that difference. That difference is part of what it means to be a human being. So of course I'm going to take advantage of the reopening plan and go and have a barbecue with my friends and watch boxing in Vancouver on July 24th. I'm counting the days to it already. I can't wait. But that's the point of making decisions collectively, is that if we have a good political system that speaks to our better natures, we collectively will make a choice better than each of us would do if we were asked to make that choice as individuals. In many ways, I think that politics is like a wedding ring, right? If you want to hear my real socialist defense of like why it's important to use the power of the crowd to force me to do things that I know I should do but won't, it's the wedding ring. The wedding ring shows how long we've recognized that conflict in our existence. Because you solemnize a wedding after you've become a couple, after you've decided that you are only with that person and only for that person for the rest of your life. And what the ring is for is to ask everyone else help you to be faithful. And because you can't actually be faithful all by yourself, you need the solidarity of everyone around you to fulfill your marital vows. And so when they see the ring, they throw in and they help you be the person that we collectively want to be, who is better actually than any one of us could pull off individually without the support of those around us. That's how I feel about the reopening plan. I'm disappointed, right? I would have voted for a plan that kept more people safe, that prevented more people from dying. But knowing that other people are going to get to do whatever they want, and that I can't by myself produce those outcomes that could only be achieved collectively, I'm going to make a different set of choices that is going that I understand will be part of a big set of choices that will endanger some people. And I think libertarians and the taxpayer movement, they keep trying to erase that fundamental conflict. But that's actually been like the most important subject in Greek literature, right? Was this question: what is the difference between being a good man and being a good citizen? The TV series Deadwood is entirely about that question, to show you the difference, that you sympathize. Sometimes you sympathize with the good citizen. Sometimes you sympathize with the good person. But I wish we were in a space socially and politically where we could talk about this as like a profound ethical conundrum that comes from being part of a civilization, rather than just the silliness of the debate and, Maxime Overdrive getting on the road and getting himself arrested, trying to free the people of wherever the heck he was in Manitoba, all 7 of them who came to his rally. That does not dignify this debate, and there's, obviously there are many things that people prize to a tremendous degree in this day and age, but dignity does not appear to be one of them. And I think if we had cared about dignity a little more, our own dignity and the dignity of others, we might have been able to use COVID to have that big conversation about, the wedding ring theory of politics, shall we say.
Here. Someday, hopefully, we return to the great chain of being that we've lost for so long. Stuart, it's always wonderful to have you here on Thursdays. Thank you so much for blessing us with your knowledge. We'll have you on again next week, and we'll chat with you then.
All right. Thanks so much, Nathan. Always a pleasure.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Well, we've come to the end of our time here on Mountain Standard Time that we have on Thursdays, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays from 9 to 11 Pacific, 10 a.m. to 12 Mountain. I'm your host, of course, Nathan Giede. And just as one last shout out to our sponsor, we're going to go back into Resistance Coffee. Again, Resistance Coffee, they do not support woke causes. They support freedom in this country. If you can support them by purchasing their coffee beans using our promo code of the Western Standard for 10% off your first order, you'll be helping people live in freedom and not in tyranny. So that's the end of our show for today. Tune in again next week. We're going to bring on some questions around China and money laundering. We're also going to be talking about what independence might mean for Alberta and the West. And finally, of course, at the end of the week, as always, we'll have Aaron and Stuart on to tell us what's what in BC and Canada. Thank you so much for tuning in and watching. This was Mountain Standard Time. Have a great weekend.